As we resume our studies in the book we usually call the Gospel or the Good News of Mark, we come to an incident in Jesus' ministry which is described in the following way in chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. Mark tells us, "Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' So they called to the blind man, 'Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you.' Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. 'What do you want me to do for you?' Jesus asked him. The blind man said, 'Rabbi, I want to see.' 'Go,' said Jesus. 'Your faith has healed you.' Immediately, Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Those who recorded the miracles of Jesus saw them, as Jesus himself did, as a form of acted parable. In other words, they were events that pointed beyond the mere event itself to important lessons about Jesus and his kingdom. And this seems to be the case here. So a remarkable miracle does take place. A blind man has his sight restored in an instant. But this is merely noted as having taken place. It's not described. All the emphasis lies upon the blind man Bartimaeus' response to Jesus and Jesus' response to him. And it's clear that the lessons that are to be drawn from this exchange are ones that we are also intended to grasp and apply to ourselves. We do not know what Bartimaeus had heard about Jesus before this story. However, he had heard enough to realize that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the one that the Old Testament had promised would arise from among David's descendants. Indeed, we do not know what Bartimaeus expected of the Messiah, but we do know that he realized that the Messiah would be able to bring him sight. For the prophet Isaiah had said so in chapter 61 verse 1 of his prophecy. However, with perhaps only a scanty understanding of exactly what the Messiah would be like, but confident that God honors his promises, Bartimaeus was quick to look to Jesus for help when opportunity arose. And he was not to be deflected from his purpose by the discouragement of the crowd, who thought Jesus had better things to do than spend time with a blind beggar. Now, if, as we have already suggested, we're to look beyond the miracle itself to its significance for us, I suggest that the lesson may be this. We may not have tied up every loose end in our understanding about Jesus. Indeed, we may still be confused about many things concerning him, but if we understand enough to recognize we need him to help us, that is a good start, and sometimes it's quite enough to be getting on with. Whatever others might say to us, we should act upon what we have already come to understand and believe. We've already noticed that this section of Mark's Gospel is devoted to lessons about following Jesus, to helping us answer the question, what will following Jesus require of me? Here then is part of the answer. To begin, we simply need to know we need him. So, and this may be making the same point in another way, we notice that Jesus is ready to have mercy on all those of us who seek his help. At this time in his ministry, Jesus was preoccupied with coming events, as this passage makes clear. And he had recently given a detailed account of what was going to happen to him, just up the road from Jericho, in Jerusalem. However, Jesus still had time to meet the needs of this poor, blind beggar and to deal on a one-to-one basis with him as though he was the only person who mattered. There is tremendous encouragement here. Sometimes we too may be inclined to think that Jesus is unlikely to have time for the likes of us, and is not likely to be willing to stoop to the depth or detail of our need. However, if even at such a time Jesus was ready to find time for Bartimaeus, we can be sure that he has time for us. And Jesus sought nothing from Bartimaeus but simple trust that he could help him. So Mark reminds us, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." So Jesus was ready to offer mercy to the least and the lowest, and the channel through which that grace flowed was humble trust in him. Carefully, Jesus brought Bartimaeus to the point of acknowledging his trust and then responding to it. Millions upon millions of Christians over 20 centuries have found Jesus to be unchanged. Humble trust is enough to solicit his help. So Jesus expects nothing of us to prepare ourselves for receiving his mercy. It's enough that we acknowledge our need, his ability to meet it, and trust him for it. Humble trust brought Bartimaeus the best day's begging of his entire life. And Jesus is the same today. Finally, we are reminded that true discipleship begins with simply asking Jesus to help us when we are helpless. But it also requires that we should be ready to follow Jesus. So we are told immediately Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus along the way. Since we know his name, it's likely that he became one of the first and most well-known disciples of Jesus. Elsewhere we've noted that others were forbidden to physically follow Jesus. However, that does not seem to happen here, and there's no reason to see Bartimaeus as being disobedient. Rather, the natural response to having received mercy from Jesus was to follow him, whether or not joining actually in the journey to Jerusalem. This then reminds us, and is surely intended to remind us, that while grace is free, it is still demanding. For if we, like Bartimaeus, have sought Jesus' mercy and received it, the natural response is to follow in his footsteps. Even though the upward path be one that leads to Jerusalem, and, as we will see, to death on Calvary's hill. This was, of course, the lesson of the previous story. And it is further illustrated in the life of a simple, blind beggar here. This is a simple and a lovely story, but it's one that reminds us of the foundations of Christian faith, and both the initial and ongoing responses that we are expected to make in building upon it if we're to follow Jesus into his kingdom.